we have this new tech stack, right? What will we build with it? What will be the new things that get built over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years on top of this tech stack?
Yorke Rhodes is Microsoft's Director of Strategy and Transformation, where he leads company efforts in blockchain and Web3. In this episode, Yorke and I break down Microsoft's evolution into artificial intelligence, gaming, and Web3.
AI is now a part of the toolkit. The next thing you do for the next 5 to 10 years is going to have AI as part of that toolkit.
Yorke shines light onto how this new, modernized version of Microsoft will change your work experience, your privacy rights, and even create new communities.
This type of utility will show up in every productivity tool that we use. Whether it's Word, PowerPoint, Excel, we're going to see the add-on and the benefits of AI associated with that.
It's always a pleasure speaking with Yorke, a true leader in this tech space and a colleague of mine at NYU. Yorke, thanks a lot for joining me. Yorke, good morning. Thanks for joining Some Future Day. It's great to see you today.
Great to see you too.
So I got to ask you, for a guy that's been involved in blockchain to the extent that you have, as well as for the length that you have, when is blockchain going to have its Chat GPT moment? When will blockchain become ubiquitous? When will it reach the masses?
It's a great question. I'm glad you started there because that's definitely something that I've been sort of predicting for quite some time. When I got into blockchain in 2015, which is really where I went down the rabbit hole, I spent about 6 months really just thinking about like how has technology evolved in the web stacks, and how should we think about this technology as it relates to that. And if you ever listen to Tim Berners-Lee, who's one of the, essentially a lot of people regard him as the father of the internet tech stack, and I just watched an interesting interview with him when he was at CERN as a young researcher, when he actually came up with this idea that you could hyperlink from one thing to another. The comments that he makes about the internet that he really feels like where sort of it fell down was actually an identity. So that sort of pushes you towards, well, what form of identity? What does identity mean in a decentralized substrate like the internet? How do we think about those technologies in a way that allows a consumer to be self-representative and in control over their personal data, and actually have a system that, if you're going to represent a human being that is self-sovereign, that's actually incorruptible by regime change and things like that. And so, from a tech stack perspective, this has now been well studied since blockchain came onto the scene. Blockchain has taught us that there's a way to have a technical substrate which gives you self-sovereignty. And so that's pretty interesting, right? And it actually fills in a hole that Tim Berners-Lee recognized and has recognized for quite some time. So that's a foundational technology. Blockchain also teaches us that you can transact value on the internet in a way that is very hard today, where you're transferring digital assets essentially of various forms that have a lot of attributes associated with them, and one of those attributes can be value. And then thirdly, this idea that you can have an identity and own your own data sort of closes the loop on this concept of digital assets and ownership. And so you now have this tech stack, which almost a decade in, right, has evolved and matured. And I was having this conversation with someone yesterday. It's like, well, where are we on the journey if you compare this to the internet and e-commerce and the scaled up applications that we see, particularly in the e-commerce space? And, only a couple of years ago, I would have said that in the blockchain space, we were like in the sort of the pre-internet stage, right? Like before consumers became aware of the internet, which largely was around 1995, right? Microsoft had actually an interesting opportunity to have something to do with that moment by introducing as the default technology stack for networking into Windows 95, basically replaced a proprietary networking stack with TCP/IP, which is the stack of the internet as a default. So now when consumers, this is 1995, Microsoft shipped Windows 95. It was actually just the anniversary recently of that. You might have seen some videos of Microsoft executives dancing around on stage to the Rolling Stones song, Start Me Up, which, by the way, Microsoft licensed for that purpose. So like anybody who was buying a PC at that point that had Windows as an OEM software stack installed on it was getting actually proper access to the internet without any additional configuration, even though like the broadband telecom infrastructure wasn't quite there yet, right? And so that, to me, if you go back and you look at that, what does that represent? You have multiple browser companies at that point in time that enabled you to get access to the internet, including Netscape and Mozilla and Microsoft and others. That is the internet stack, and that's largely the internet stack that we have still today, right? It's, I mean, yes, HTML has evolved, right? But broadly, it's that tech stack. And then you had the 5 years of, the building on top of that, right? Which then wound up in being the dot-com boom, essentially. And then obviously at the end of the 90s, the dot-com bust. And what happened in 2000? What happened in 2001 was people realized this technology was mature. Right? And if you realize that this technology was mature, you can go build scaled up massive consumer businesses on top of that. So where we are today in blockchain is, I think we're at this point, it feels like to me that like we sort of scale, we've solved identity, we've solved self-sovereignty, we've solved privacy essentially through various approaches, including zero-knowledge proofs. Zero-knowledge proofs are scaling very fast, and blockchains are scaling very fast, right? And so like you say, okay, well, scale, privacy, self-sovereignty, and then also wallet technology is maturing pretty dramatically to help protect consumers. And then you say, well, we have browsers like Opera browser, Brave browser, the Chromium browser doesn't quite have Web3 in it yet, but Microsoft Edge actually has a very early build of a crypto wallet browser inside of Edge. What this effectively means is that we've now got this new internet stack, right? And so to me, I propose that we are actually sitting at the time frame around 2000, 2001 when this new internet stack emerged and starts to become the default thing that's available, whether consumers care or not, right? Just like in 1995, consumers didn't care, but the stack was available. The next wave of mass consumer adoption or development and then adoption can happen, right? And so one of the things that I've been challenging myself and other people that I speak with is, what can you imagine can now be built on top of this new foundation? And that's where I think we are. I think we're at this stage where you could build massive consumer applications on top of this new tech stack, which is the evolved internet tech stack, which many people would call a Web3 enabled internet tech stack.
So it seems to me, and part of the conversations I've been having with my circle is that with the advent of artificial intelligence, we might have an acceleration in the crypto space in Web3. But there is also this inherent tension, almost like a philosophical tension between the concept of crypto and or blockchain with AI. For example, centralization, right, versus decentralization. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, can artificial intelligence help crypto evolve, and or can crypto help artificial intelligence evolve in certain ways? And you mentioned zero knowledge proof. I think like this might be a good segue to get into the discussion about zero knowledge proofs and perhaps how crypto specifically could help AI evolve in certain ways. But I'll leave it to you, Yorke. I just threw out I threw out a lot at you. So
Well, I mean, so just going back to your question about ChatGPT moment, I think the tech stack is poised, right, to get there.
Right.
I would also make just a amendment to what I said as well, because I think the new tech stack also has AI infused in it, right? And so everything that we're doing now in consumer applications, both at Microsoft and every other large tech provider, is looking at how to infuse AI into productivity tools, right? Whether it's Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., it is a productivity enhancer, right? So that becomes a tool that becomes part of this tech stack that you build on top of. And largely, if you look at what ChatGPT is, it is a utility function for every other application that's very accessible, which is what ChatGPT made possible. So I think in the context of the stack, that's what we largely have now, right? We have this very capable foundation plus this amazing utility that you can really think about as the future of how you build applications. Secondly, to your point about like this either tension between Web3 technologies and other technologies like AI or benefits of technologies across ecosystems, I think one of the most amazing things that the Web3 ecosystem has provided to core researchers, including folks at Microsoft Research and others, is and cryptocurrencies are an example of this. We have a worldwide infrastructure that allows you to create self-sovereign digital identities, allows you to create owned assets by those identities, allows you to transfer value, right? So it's a demonstration of a scaled up worldwide infrastructure that can support those concepts. That is a playground for anybody doing fundamental research in encryption technology, whether it's one-way hashes or zero-knowledge proofs or homomorphic encryption or fully homomorphic encryption. These are all like encryption technologies or identities, right? Like how do we think about identity and authentication differently based on this capability versus the old world of what we considered identity, which was really just logins to things like Facebook and Google and Microsoft, et cetera. So first of all, this technology foundation, one of the most interesting things about it is it actually has helped to speed the iteration of these technologies. And particularly and you see this in encryption technologies, particularly around looking at fully homomorphic encryption and zero knowledge proofs. And the reason it's speeding the iterations on those is because it's a applied use of those technologies, right? And this is one of the challenges with fundamental research. Fundamental research is obviously required, but if you're not doing applied engineering with the outcomes of fundamental research, you don't iterate fast. And so this Web3 substrate has allowed these technologies to iterate really quickly, and a whole community of users, the Web3 builders, see these technologies and recognize their power and are pushing the envelope, right, on those things that were only a couple of years ago still just fundamental research things. And so big benefits of having an applied substrate like that is value to other technologies. Right, and so encryption is an example of that, and that's why again we can talk about zero knowledge proofs and what that means in a minute. This applies to AI as well, right? And so, what do we know that AI needs in order for AI to be trustworthy and trustful? It needs provenance, right? And what do we fully understand from a technical foundation perspective from the Web3 world? It's provenance, right? And it's not just provenance, but it's various different ways of providing consumer privacy, enterprise data privacy, as well on top of a substrate that gives you provenance. And so I think one of the added values that Web3 will help do is actually more quickly help to realize how to do provenance at scale in AI datasets and AI training and AI outputs. I think that's a huge benefit. Without Web3, people would just be trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to do provenance? How do I figure that out? How do I do that with my Azure Active Directory centralized directly of users, right? With Web3, that becomes a conversation that is, okay, AI runs everywhere. AI doesn't necessarily, unless you're doing it in enterprise context, have a authentication directory, right, associated with user access to it, like ChatGPT, you just use it, right? How do I think about provenance in that context? How do I prove provenance in that context? And so that's an advent, I think, that accelerates that journey for AI in that way.
I imagine from there, like other issues extend off of not just provenance, but issues of, whether or not the machine is properly trained, right? Like issues that you mentioned earlier as it relates to trust, but also bias and, other ethical concerns are there too. So is that where zero knowledge proof can come into play?
Zero knowledge proof essentially allows you to provide the proof of something without revealing the underlying things. And so that doesn't seem obvious, right? How that's valuable in an AI context. But if you think about training data, you want to prove maybe the absence of bias in training data, right? You don't need to show the actual data because a consumer would never know how to consume all that data. But you'd want to provide a trust score that says this ran through some algorithm, right? That algorithm did an analysis of the bias, and the intent to bias and things like that you would do on a training data set, and it got this score. That is an okay score. Here's a trust certificate, potentially with the score, that says the training data was unbiased or unbiased to a certain level, right? That type of thing is quite useful in a consumer context because anybody who wants to know could look at the trust certificate and the trust score and know without having to look at the data that it actually has the appropriate characteristics, right? An unbiased data set, right, as part of the definition of how the AI model got to the answer it got to.
So it's kind of interesting because it also touches on the topic of proof of humanity or proof of being alive. And I know that Microsoft has a major investment in Sam Altman's company, OpenAI. Sam's also one of the founders of WorldCoin, which, as you're probably very well aware, is now using biometrics vis-a-vis a retina scan, essentially a way to apply zero knowledge proof, right?
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain how that works? And then I think that's like a nice link between how zero knowledge proof can come into play from a practical perspective, right? Beyond just the technology.
So WorldCoin is both a software stack as well as a hardware orb. So one of the concerns about the physical device, the orb, is that physical devices in an encryption world that are things like your phone, for example, which also has secure enclave technology in it. If someone gets a hold of your physical device, then they can basically do all kinds of physical attacks on that device. So that in itself is an attack surface, right? And so the orb, right, if it's stolen, then someone can do some physical attacks on the orb, right? So that's a concern. And perhaps those physical attacks are breaking things open and getting into content. Perhaps that physical attack is, hey, somebody stole it for a couple of days. They opened it up, they re-engineered something, they injected some malware, right, or Trojan capabilities into the device. Possibly, I'm making this up, right?
Yeah.
But that's the problem with a physical device. It's not necessarily in your control, right? That's a vulnerability in any kind of encryption and privacy
The hardware.
system. Yeah, exactly, right? And if you look at in the world of cloud, one of the reasons why cloud are secure is because they have a very secure physical perimeter around the data centers, right? And so that helps with people not being able to just walk into a data center and start doing physical attacks on the hardware, right? So that is a vulnerability in itself. The second vulnerability is the software. And these are possible vulnerabilities, right? And when you're doing security, you look at attack surfaces. So what you're doing when you look into an orb is you're doing a retinal scan, right? And so there's software and hardware inside of this device that handles the retinal scan. And then what does it do with that content? Typically in a biometric system, and I believe WorldCoin does the same, biometric systems, whether you're being enrolled or whether you're actually scanning, they don't save essentially the data that allows you to reproduce a retina, they save a fingerprint associated with that. And that fingerprint is what is unique. So you can't go and recreate the retina to create that same fingerprint again. It's basically a fingerprint, which is what is unique. In the context of what they're doing with zero knowledge is they actually take some variation, probably a hash of that. And I'm being a little bit vague because I haven't read the documents recently, but they largely do something like this, right? Where basically you transform a piece of data like the fingerprint of the retina into a hash. You store the hash with other scanned hashes on a distributed ledger, and now you have a representation of myself through my unique retina on this distributed ledger through hash technology, and it's just a fingerprint, right? It's not the ability to recreate me. It's just a fingerprint of that. And what that allows you to do is ensure that there's never a second registration with the same retina, right? So that basically creates a unique account associated with one individual based on their retina. That's done, by the way, through zero knowledge proof. So you don't want access to the original content, but you do want to know, is my retina already resident in a hash table, essentially, in this distributed ledger.
So it sounds like biometrics then, Yorke, are like to have like the highest level of privacy, but yet to prove that you're a living human being. It sounds like biometrics are going to be the only way to solve that problem with zero knowledge proof in mind. Because I've worked with a sovereign entity to get ID using zero knowledge proof, right? I actually have a sovereign issued governmental backed ID from Palau. I think I mentioned this to you, but that was, I had to go through the government and
right. You're basically going through a KYC process, right?
Correct.
Right. And which, like if you look at what is the most recognized forms of ID associated with a person today, right? It's some form of governmental ID, right? Whether it's a passport or a driver's license or what have you, right? So that's kind of the scaled up, what you would call claims, right? Essentially in a technical context, claims about this person. So for example, a New York State driver's license is a claim that Yorke Rhodes, who holds that driver's license, is actually okay to drive, right? And claims are in some ways similar to zero knowledge proofs because you don't have to know anything, right, about what's on that driver's license. But if I hold it, it's a second factor. So my person plus that license gives me two things, right? I am who I am, right? And that's proven through me hold through this thing and a picture on that I hold. And it gives me an authorization, right, to drive, assuming it's not expired, right? Obviously, right? So the technologies in the identity space and digital identity space is something called a verifiable claim, which is basically how you would recreate that scenario using decentralized identities.
So if you bring that into like the real world for the people watching and listening, just to as it relates to a person's ID specifically, do we really need then a traditional form of ID like a driver's license or a passport as it relates to owning and buying, let's say, objects in the future, perhaps, a car or a home, a boat and beyond?
Yeah. So today a government is the issuing party behind a passport, right, or a driver's license, and there's a presumption that you belong to that entity, right, and that's something like your residency, right, or your social security number in the context of the U.S. That same framework can very well work with decentralized identities, and essentially instead of having the government effectively own my identity, I own my identity, and the government becomes a party that says, okay, associated with this identity, here's a credential that says that, okay, we went through this KYC process, we know this is Yorke Rhodes, and Yorke Rhodes has the ability to drive, right? So that credential, or the driver's license, becomes essentially a credential associated with my self-owned decentralized identity that I hold just like I hold a driver's license. Now, in a digital context, that's actually more powerful than the context of, how do you digitize a driver's license, right? Today, right? People ask you for a picture, right, of the front and the back side of your driver's license. That's not a great way to create a digital representation of this very important document. However, if you do it in the context of a verifiable claim, which is signed by the authority, New York State would essentially sign this claim that says, okay, we've validated that this claim is valid for this individual who's holding it. So the concepts are similar. The implementation of how we think about identity is what's different under the covers, and it creates actually a more powerful way of interacting that's actually less complicated than typical federated scenarios. Federated meaning issued by a large authority. The ability to do things in the context of my identity that's less duplicative is actually quite powerful. So a great example of that is, in the financial context with Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering, my identity, my digital identity that has been established and that I own can have these claims associated with it, where I've just gone through a KYC and AML process with, say, JP Morgan, and that certificate is signed and issued by JP Morgan as a verifiable claim against my identity, one example. It could also be a zero-knowledge proof. Those things, I think, are sort of overlapping in some ways. And that claim would allow me to go to the next bank and say, you guys don't need to rerun this. I just did this a week ago, right? With JP Morgan, you don't have to go through that same level of diligence. I have it, right? Here's the claim. And if you really want to know that JP Morgan did it, you can actually follow the trail and, in fact, get a new signature from JP Morgan digitally.
And then Yorke, what would be the benefit to something like that if a person, let's say, is looking to operate in the metaverse? Is that a situation where in real time they can perhaps get a loan to purchase a digital asset while they're, operating in Fortnite or something along that line?
Yeah, it enables digital interactions. A metaverse is a great metaphor for that, right? Because in a metaverse, you might want to purchase something and you don't have enough money in whichever accounts you want to call those accounts, whether it's crypto accounts, stable coins, or Venmo, PayPal, whatever, right? And so you want to, in a digital context in the metaverse, right, which is metaverses are essentially global, and anybody can go into Fortnite, anybody can go into most metaverses, no matter where they are in the world. And then in that context, actually do a transaction digitally, you need some verification that that person is who they say they are, right? That essentially they're the KYC, right? And so it would enable you in the digital context to very quickly establish that, yes, you've recently been through a KYC AML certification and you have it, you can present it. And therefore, the speed with which you could actually provide a loan to that person, first of all, you're going past the AML KYC issue very quickly. And then second of all, probably want to do some other kinds of verifications as well. Like, for example, what is this person's income? Or what is this person's, available,
Proof
cash
of
reserves?
solvency.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Proof of solvency is one of the ways that you think about this in the context of digital assets in financial world. And that's also another interesting case where you could prove solvency to establish a certain level of creditworthiness to get a loan without revealing a ton of underlying data, right? And so today, proof of solvency in a physical world, just think about going and getting a mortgage, is all kinds of paperwork, right? Or any kind of loan, right? It's all kinds of paperwork from different institutions, right? In the context of something like proof of solvency, that's a proof using technology like zero-knowledge proofs that can prove that it has all the backing documentation and that you have a certain level of solvency, and that certificate or that proof proves that without having to actually go and look at all the source documentation again, right? And without having to have that source documentation available at the split second that the proof is being evaluated.
So I know we've gone down a rabbit hole, and I want to get back to how zero knowledge proof will help artificial intelligence progress. But before we go there, it seems like what you're talking about as it relates to verifiable personal identification as well as proof of solvency through zero knowledge proof and blockchain technology can open up a new type of banking sector, could allow for people to have, loans issued like on the spot for digital assets that, traditional retail banking might not have ever even thought about. Like I want to buy that digital sword for $10,000, and imagine if you and I walked into Bank of America and we asked for a $10,000 loan to purchase a sword for Fortnite, they would laugh us out of there. But these things could become actually reality. Do you agree?
I do, and I think like having lived through the '90s era when stock options were a way that tech companies helped create a bigger compensation package for employees. Banks didn't know what stock options were worth, right? To
Right.
like they couldn't conceptualize that, right? And so I kind of think very similarly around like different forms of digital assets. Like this is just a new form of value that's not quite yet understood broadly. Although I think if you look at most thoughtful financial institutions, they very much see the benefits of tokenizing all different types of assets, including real world assets, because it just speeds up your ability to transact on those assets. So yeah, if you go back to my point earlier in this conversation is we have this new tech stack, right? What will we build with it? What will be the new things that get built over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years on top of this tech stack?
So, what about the issue of, I touched on it a little earlier, but just to expand on it, the issue of whether or not these machines are being trained properly. Can zero knowledge proof somehow be built into verifying whether or not the model has been trained properly? It seems to me like some of these large language models are like, so massive. I don't know if zero knowledge proof is capable yet of verifying everything that's coming out of, GPT-4 or other types of large language models. But is there a value as it relates to the machine learning piece of it?
I think you have to be, rather than trying to like bite off the whole cake, right? Look at a specific use case and think through the use case and how there might be value, in a specific use case. And a great example is in terms of how we show up in a digital context. How do you know that Mark is talking to Yorke? Right? That's one problem, right? And you can see this by the way every day if you're following anything that's going on with AI, the ability to replicate my voice with different words and the ability to replicate my digital presence, my visual digital presence, is possible today. It's just a matter of horsepower and the types of algorithms they're using. And there's very accessible consumer examples of this. And so that now goes to this problem, which is how do I know what I'm looking at is not synthetic? And how do I know? How do we get to this representation of these words coming out of this synthetic version of someone's presence, right? And obviously, that's a very significant concern, right, from a destabilization of democracies and other, very bad uses of outcomes potentially. So then the question becomes, how did you get here from the perspective of the inputs and the models and the presentation of those? And that's effectively provenance. We talked a little bit about provenance earlier as well. And what that means is you want to understand how this digital experience was created that I'm looking at. What were the tools? What were the transformations? What were the inputs? Were those actually Yorke's words from some valid source? Was the image that was created of Yorke, whether it's still or moving, what is the origin of that particular image that is it, that gives it validity, right? As an actual human image taken with film or with a camera. and not a synthetic, right, outcome. So both of those things are, you have to essentially go back to the source of the data, look at how the data is being transformed, have proofs associated with the source, have proofs associated with the transformation that shows that the transformation was valid and okay. And this involves, zero knowledge proofs, signatures, all along this chain of custody associated with how this digital experience of a person was created.
So it seems to me that with the election cycle about to heat up again, this idea of deep fakes in politics is, really important. I heard an anecdote, interestingly. It was a friend of mine in the tech space that was talking about C2PA. Is that it, Yorke? Where
C2,
essentially a
yeah.
signet, it's C2PA? So
C2PA, yeah.
if I'm getting this right, it's essentially it allows for the creator technology, like a camera, to have a signature on the original content
Yep,
to show that it's real, that it's authentic,
that's right.
and that
Yep,
politicians, because of deep fakes, may consider now literally going into the marketplace, having conversations and literally recording everything that they're saying to show the time and the date that they said it, and then using this type of signature to authenticate what they said so they could push back on deep fakes. Have you heard anything about this yet?
yeah. So C2PA is actually an organization that was co-founded by some camera companies and some tech companies, and so I think Adobe is part of it, Microsoft's part of it, Sony, Nikon, a couple other camera manufacturers. And the idea, exactly as you described it, is we want to ensure that we know the origin of content in a film, right, whether it's video or moving, still or video context, right? And so the C2PA actually describes essentially a signing mechanism on that content, which packages the original content plus a bunch of metadata directly from the camera that's not manipulable with the caveat of what I said earlier, which is, right, as soon as hardware is out in the wild, hardware is an attack surface, right? But inside the concept here is that hardware can hold a signature, can hold a secure enclave, can sign with the key that's in the secure enclave that allows you to create an envelope, a package, which says, this is the original photo, and this photo was taken with this other associated metadata, the things that you would typically see from a camera, plus things like GPS, right, time and location, which
Right.
helps you establish the origin provenance of that particular piece of film. Now, what happens to film, as you're probably aware, is if you take an original 12 megabyte photo, that's not what gets published on a website. It's not much, right? It gets transformed before it's published on a website.
It's going to be
so,
edited for newspaper publication, digitally, et cetera, right? So does it lose that signature then once it's modified?
It gets an additional signature. So that's why Adobe is involved, right? So Adobe
Oh,
has
interesting.
Photoshop and other tooling which does digital transformations of media content, right? And so in the context of something like Adobe, modifying, whether it's cropping or doing something else, maybe enhancing the colors, right, associated with a particular picture, that transformation, cropping or modifying the colors, is then a validated transformation. The software would actually sign it with the software's key and say, this is a valid transformation. Here's the inputs before the transformation. Here's the transformation algorithm that we used, and here's the outputs after the transformation. So now it becomes a validated, signed transformation by this piece of software. So that becomes part of the provenance associated with this piece of digital media. And that gives you, if you think about that, wind that all the way forward to the concept of a deep fake. If it's completely synthetic, you won't have that original signature on the content, right? You won't have the validated transformations of that content into the final product. And so provenance of things that are synthetic, that are generated by AI is extremely important, right? And that is, again, going back to what's the value case of having a scaled up applied engineering substrate like Web3, those concepts are very well understood in the context of Web3. How do we have validation of media by consumers without the necessity to have a federated authority that is you log into to go find it, right? And if you sort of wind that back to the early days of the web and e-commerce, these types of trust certificates, which in our scenario here would roll up essentially all of the various proofs associated with those transformations into the final product, that trust certificate would be something, say, maybe you would see it on the screen here and be able to click on a little eye in the corner, which very much like a website or an e-commerce site would give you, here's the trail of trust associated with the provenance of this data, which shows you where it comes from. In the context of political campaigns, what you typically see on the bottom of a political ad is this ad is authorized by.
Yep.
Right. So that could be an additional signature on the content, which if you say click on, in a digital context, you click on this little eye and you get the trail, part of that signature would be that it's a valid piece of content authorized by a political figure.
So Yorke, the concept of like one of the pillars of cryptography is the idea that we have a higher level of trust. Is that a fair assessment? A trust of the data that's passing between the two parties?
Trust that the data is tamper evident.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily change your trust in the data. It changes your trust in who created it, how it was handled, right? What was the custody of that?
So it's got to be a really exciting time to be at Microsoft right now. In June of 2023, McKinsey issued a report estimating that artificial intelligence technology could add $2.6 trillion to $4.4 trillion in annual value to the global economy by making an array of processes more efficient and effective. So that's really interesting. Evercore predicted that AI could add $50 to $100 billion to Microsoft's annual revenue by 2027. And this past February, in February of 2023, your CEO, Satya Nadella, said, I've not seen something like this since I would say 2007, 2008, when the cloud was just first coming out. So my question to you, Yorke, is how do you expect Microsoft to capitalize on artificial intelligence first, and then to follow up really beyond the obvious for the people that are into tech and following tech, like which new products can we expect and what utilitarian type of features will these products have?
Great question. So I think first of all, describing AI as a utility is completely valid, right? It's how do you leverage this new technology to make you more productive in the things that you're trying to do. This fundamentally changes like writing and blog writing and the productivity that you can actually achieve, whether you're a student or a writer or a researcher. Just having the facility of this assistant, which helps do things that you would normally do yourself. And then you become more of an editor versus a writer. That's quite useful, and I think we're going to see a lot of that. There was a great lecture by Ethan Mollick. I don't know if you know that name. He's a Wharton professor, and he teaches entrepreneurship, and he's obviously very down the AI rabbit hole. And one of the questions he asked actually in a session that I participated in as part of my NYU instruction last week was, how many people in the audience have spent more than 10 hours working just with things like ChatGPT and OpenAI and essentially the tooling, whether it's Midjourney or writing tools and things like that. And it's a really interesting data point, but that kind of pushes you to say, well, am I using this technology enough, right? It's available today. Why are I not using this technology more, right? And so as I go into the teaching in the fall semester, I'm going to totally expect that my students are using AI to help them be much more efficient in writing blogs and things like that, right? And so what does that mean from an instructor perspective? I'm going to assume that the content is going to go up in terms of output, right? The sophistication of the content should ideally be higher, right? And the level of writing should be higher because it's now easier for you to get to the end product. That's just productivity, right? And so this type of utility will show up in every productivity tool that we use. Whether it's Word, PowerPoint, Excel, or any kind of other modeling tools, we're going to see the add-on and the benefits of AI associated with that. And in a programming context, it's actually been happening for quite some time. If you look at the GitHub Copilot capability, it's been in the market for a while. It helps what I just described about blog writing. It does that for programmers. It helps programmers more quickly arrive at something that's a reasonable implementation of what they're trying to achieve. And then obviously you go through and modify things that you need to tweak. And additionally, Ethan Mollick actually used this example. He's not a programmer, but he's able to actually write Python code to show visualizations based on the data that he's working with because of AI, right? And so there's this very transformative and productivity transcendent capability that AI gives us, which is why I think the term utility is a really important utility, because it's not like you're going to create necessarily a new product, right? You're actually creating value through the technology in existing productivity applications. Now,
so what does that do for like innovation as it relates to mankind? Are you saying that the new language for coding is English or will be English?
Yeah, there's definitely people who are saying that, right? Like
Right?
the fact that you can construct a sentence that can be transformed into code, and the language of choice of that code can be many, right? Is quite powerful, right? It now obviously when you have your tools on something, your fingers on something powerful, you have to have some context of like what is that thing doing and what does it mean, at least in the early stages. So I think we will continue to see lots of examples of that. There are examples of that on the internet. Like there's I don't know if you're familiar with the Baby AGI application.
I've heard of it, but I've never used it.
Okay, so there's what Baby AGI in terminology, put terminology aside, but AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. The concept of Baby AGI was how do I use AI as it exists today to try to get sort of closer to that. And what Baby AGI is, it's basically taking multiple steps, feeding that into AI creating some output, taking that output, feeding it into the next step of things that I need to do to get to an end state I'm trying to get to. And this interesting and also quite viral thing that happened on the internet in the last month or two, guess who wrote it? It was written by a VC, not by a programmer.
Right. This is my point. So how will that impact? So if the argument is that now English will be the programmer's common language, that means that it opens up to people with no computer science background, right? If a VC wrote, right? If a VC wrote that, how is that going to advance science, medicine? It could fuel job creation. It could have impacts on, the film industry and beyond.
Yeah, if so, a couple of things. One, we're having a conversation in English, right? An example of where a large language model in real time would be quite useful is if you don't speak English, right? We could be having a conversation that's translated on the fly. That capability has been around for a while. It just hasn't been fast enough, right?
Right.
And so it's a great example for things like Zoom and Teams and discussions like this where you could have language models translating from English into other languages on the fly. And you can imagine this would be this type of thing that happens in the UN, right? In the UN, when someone speaks in a particular language, there's all these translators, right, that are human beings translating, the answer. So you could do that more quickly, and you could still have human Copilot, right, intervention, which says, okay, I agree with that translation. right? Or I would tweak that translation, right? Use this word instead of that word. Because the people who are doing those translations are highly trained, right, around the nuances of the subject matter areas. And so having that Copilot, scenario would be useful there. So I think we're going to see just these massive changes in the assumptions that we make about communication. In addition, to your point about the film industry, there are so many examples on the internet of like short films and feature-length films that are completely created through someone using AI prompts, right, to generate outputs. And a lot of techniques actually that have been performed for years just can be enhanced with AI to more quickly get to the outcome. So I think we'll see in almost any kind of digital media a speed up in the ability to arrive at the outcome. And film and video and feature-length films and film production and games and metaverse experiences, those are all 3D context digital media experiences.
So will Microsoft, is this part of the evolution of Microsoft? Will Microsoft take on this new type of almost like a new form of Microsoft, a new entity of sorts, with OpenAI really, arguably leading the path of AI, artificial intelligence, and Microsoft having such a significant ownership stake in OpenAI? Is the Microsoft company evolving again? Are we seeing this new type of entity unfolding before our eyes?
So, not speaking as a Microsoft spokesperson, but like speaking as somebody who's observing, I think there's two lenses to that. One, Microsoft's already spoken about having this capability in all of its productivity applications.
Yeah.
That's one. And as an example, there's Microsoft, I think it's called Microsoft Create, that's now part of the browser, that actually uses DALL-E, right, to create imagery and to help with things you might want to do that type of imagery for. To your point about advertising, that speeds, or production of advertising content, it speeds that up. So Microsoft will evolve its technology landscape, right, from every application, right, will want to take advantage of this utility and these capabilities. So I would fully expect to see across the board at Microsoft, just working on where does it make sense to infuse AI into particular products. And that could be the things that we think about that are Microsoft products like Office. It could be in Teams, it can be in LinkedIn, it can be in Dynamics, it can be in core Azure functions, right?
It's an exciting time.
Yeah, there's a lot of landscape. I mean,
I heard Elon comment that although he was obviously an early investor in OpenAI, I heard him comment that Microsoft controls OpenAI. Did you hear that?
I think Elon first of all, likes to hear himself talk, and second of all, loves to be provocative. I had not heard that, but it's not a comment I wouldn't have past him, right?
But another transformation.
By the way, one other data point. So Microsoft has a lot of its own products, but the products that are built on Microsoft technologies is actually vastly bigger, right? And so those are all of our partners, right? People who we help build, help understand, the Microsoft landscape of tooling, where they can build applications on top of that, whether that's a cloud-native startup or whether it's other types of companies. Like SAP, obviously, is a big partnership with Microsoft, even though Microsoft has Dynamics, which is a somewhat competing product in a slightly different market segment. The partnership and the ecosystem is extremely important to Microsoft. And if you look at some of the most recent partnerships that we're doing, forget OpenAI, which is just a huge unicorn type of multi-billion-dollar partnership, but look at down from there, right? The smaller partnerships, they all in some way actually include the value case of AI in those technologies, whether they're a startup or in any particular sector, right? And so we're going to see that, again, this is an enabling technology. AI is now a part of the toolkit, right? The next thing you do for the next 5 to 10 years is going to have AI as part of that toolkit. And then, as I said earlier, the tech stack of the internet has evolved to include essentially AI. And
We spoke about the value of Web3 in, the gaming metaverse earlier as it relates to Fortnite, proof of solvency, proof of being an actual living human, et cetera. But part of the transformation that Microsoft seems to be taking on also is the community that it's buying into or bringing along with regards to the $70 billion Activision Blizzard acquisition. And all of a sudden, unlocking these massive communities that are very loyal in Call of Duty and World of Warcraft and beyond. So, what's the impact to the Microsoft ecosystem when you bring these huge communities, very loyal fans, great intellectual property assets too? What's the impact on Microsoft from that perspective?
it's interesting. Like obviously, Activision is a very large acquisition, assuming it's approved and goes through everywhere. And again, speaking as an outsider, it is part of Xbox, right? And so that's a very big division at Microsoft that's specifically focused on gaming. And it's a very sizable acquisition in the gaming space. So it will have a transformative impact, on what we imagine as Microsoft gaming, right? In terms of the different studios that build product in that space. I think we briefly spoke about this as well. Is like both digital ownership and AI have a massive future in the context of gaming, related to asset ownership and things that gamers collect that today they don't really own, they're really renting them, is one. And then secondly, as you look at the utility of AI, even in its most nascent form around creating digital media, that has got to transform the work associated with bringing games to production, right? And so I think that's going to have a big impact as well. I mean, like typical AAA game production cycle is 4 years, and it's just a ton of digital content. It's very similar to, and more complicated in some ways than creating a feature film. Right? Because now it's a multiplayer game, right? So how do you think about that?
So you mentioned like if the transaction is ultimately approved, I think it's making some progress in certain regions, but your comment obviously puts my mind into where we are here in the United States. It seems like the United States government, to a certain extent, right now is like anti big tech. I'm not even talking about on the regulation side. We could get into that conversation in a second as it relates to the SEC and the confusion to cryptocurrency and all. But do you feel like there's a general United States government sentiment surrounding big tech right now where they're just kind of against it?
It's a good question. I think the United States government's a complicated set of bodies with individuals, right, which in an ideal world are responding to their constituents, in places like Congress and the Senate. And I think you hear probably a lot more noise generally than what may be actually the reality. And I think as outsiders, to that, I think a lot of people probably ascribe different motivations. And so I think, frankly, politics is very complicated, right, in that way. And ultimately it boils down to people and what people believe and what their constituents want. So I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer there. I do think that if you compare the United States to other geographies that have embraced different types of technologies, you can see a concern about slowing down innovation and slowing down progress, right? Which is what innovation drives. Where if you think about it from a competitive landscape perspective, other geographies seem to be farther ahead in certain categories. That being said, there are definitely consumer protection issues across all these technologies we've been talking about that someone's got to look after, right? And typically that's been various parts of governments, in the EU or the US or other geographies in the world. So yeah, I don't really have a strong view on that.
Sure. So, but trust is such a big issue. Like as we're evaluating the Microsoft ecosystem today, and we've touched on so many different issues as it relates to the centralized force of Microsoft touching people's lives at home while they're gaming, in the office, now through the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, decentralized as it relates to blockchain technology. How will Microsoft be able to provide a certain level of confidence as it expands its ecosystem and its reach that the customer's privacy will be protected?
It's a great question. Microsoft, I think you can find this on the Microsoft website. It says something like Microsoft runs on trust, right? And so, how do you establish trust from a technical foundation perspective? That's where you have to think. You have to be very thoughtful about how vulnerabilities are introduced into both hardware and software, and you have to put in place controls that prevent those from happening. You have to think about when a customer runs a workload, what how do you help that customer understand how to create a workload that's safe and secure and doesn't reveal secrets, as an example? How do you ensure that that customer is who's running that workload is thinking about GDPR and consumer privacy and consumer data? Those are all one sort of practices and guidance that we provide to customers. But as a technical substrate, we think very deliberately about what does the software supply chain look like? What does the software stack look like? How do you make sure that a software stack has efficacy of provenance? That's actually a big area that in the U.S. there's an executive order specifically focused on that technical area, and that's really important, right? Because if you inject malware or some kind of backdoor into a software stack without without people knowing it, right, it's basically becomes a dormant attack vector, right, that can be awoken at any point in time. So hence why the US government has created an executive order around that topic. Whether it is how do the workloads run in a trustful context, right? How do you ensure that when keys are generated to create encryption around data at rest, data in transit, and data essentially in memory or being computed on, what are the tools that you put in place to ensure that that encryption key, right, is not vulnerable, right? And how is that encryption key generated? Who holds that encryption key? Who has access to that encryption key? And enforcing things like rotation of keys and things like that. So there's a lot of policy and control around systems that really create an environment that is a trustful environment to operate code in, right? Which and underlying every application, right, that we talked about earlier, whether it's Office or Activision or LinkedIn or Dynamics or third-party workloads like SAP, it's all code, right? And so that is a technology foundation that you have to ensure from the physical plant, meaning the physical guardrails around a cloud data center, to the physical devices inside the center, to their firmware, to the software that runs on them, et cetera, all the way up the stack, right? All of those things have to be part of that trust.
And yet, it seems like Microsoft is even going deeper into capturing different types of data from individuals. Your CEO, Satya Nadella, referred to this time period as the Copilot era, which is really interesting, particularly as it relates to product now, perhaps beyond programming. So, for example, I noticed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office that Microsoft just filed for a patent surrounding an artificial intelligence powered backpack. Have you heard of this?
I saw that over the weekend also.
Yeah, so it's incredible. It's filled with sensors.
Yeah.
They provided a few illustrations, one with an individual who's skiing. I think another was in front of a Beatles poster. But again, capturing tons of data so that this backpack is no longer just an object holding, a child's school books and pens, but rather really serving as a co-pilot of sorts.
The terminology Copilot is actually a really good framing for AI, and I think I use it earlier in a discussion. But basically,
Yep.
it's like you have all this power, right? That power is really a co-pilot to the pilot, and you as the consumer are the pilot, right? And so the example I used with translators, right? The translator actually is the pilot. The AI that does the quick translations and first iteration or first draft is a co-pilot, right? And so that's a really important contextualization of how we think about the power of all of this AI utility. That ultimately the consumer's in control, right, of what gets into the final product. The second point, going back to the patent. So I don't know, I haven't seen anything internally. I don't know anything about the internal filings. As you mentioned, there was a public filing that was recently revealed through the patent office. What's interesting, though, and my first impression was, well, what's in that thing, right? And so my first reaction is literally everything is in that thing is also in your phone, right? Every sensor that's in the backpack is in the phone already, right? So we already walk around with something that has all those same sensors. And I think the utility of the backpack, as you combine it with other technologies, is that a backpack gives you a better way to carry heavy duty computing equipment, including batteries and things like that, that frees up your hands, right? Because a phone, obviously, you're manipulating with your hands. And so that, I think, is a useful context in a lot of different ways. There was also, I think, some recent filings as well around different types of headsets, right? And the range of headsets, by the way, is vast, right? From things that look like glasses, to full VR headsets with, an inability to see through the front of the headset like an Oculus, right? And I think the filing related to the headset was, and it might have been referenced in the same article that I read, was basically that these cameras would allow you to ingest the external environment into this new headset, and then manipulate imagery like you do with AR, VR, but not have the AR experience being provided through your eyes, have it actually being provided by a camera, which then gets fed into a screen, which could be opaque, right? Just like an Oculus. Now, whether that's good or not, I don't know. But the way it was described in this presentation was that it gives you a more powerful and seamless way to integrate the parts of the experience together that you would typically see through AR, because you're pulling in the external environment, but the way you're doing it, it's already digitized, right? And so it gives you a more powerful way to manipulate that. So just tying that to the backpack is, you can imagine that now you've got a backpack, which is very powerful, and you've got a headset, which is very powerful, and those could collaborate together to give you basically a experience that's a completely hands-free experience that completely understands your surrounding. Kind of feels a little bit like an autonomous vehicle, right? Or
Yeah.
an autonomous capability that, does things that we've always imagined things like glasses would do with an AR overlay, right? So, I don't know, whether that's real or not. We obviously today you can buy laptops that have some of that capability. I'm sorry, today you can buy backpacks that have some of that capability. There's a lot of backpacks, that, for example, that have battery chargers. There's backpacks which have sensors in the market. So is that an evolution of the backpack like, as we think about in the fashion world, IoT-enabled clothing, right? This is now essentially an IoT-enabled backpack, right? Seems like a natural evolution of possible use cases in the world.
Yorke, I've had you for the entire morning. Just one thing that I do with every guest is we kind of do this like predicting type of thing where I give you you essentially say like in some future day, and then I give you a prompt,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So do you mind doing one or two of those with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Real quick?
Yeah.
So it's just like a sentence, right? So for example, in some future day, my co-pilot will be
essentially a digital twin of myself, right? With a full identity as an agent that I authorize, which has a combination of this tech stack which I talked about, which is the full Web3 tech stack, which respects my self-sovereign identity, my digital ownership of things, and the utility of AI, right, which can actually speak in a digital context on my behalf.
And then finally, in some future day, Microsoft, the company, will be.
The company will have products that evolved to include the utility of AI across the product suites to the point where it is just infused in their product and consumers don't actually have to invoke it in the same way.
Awesome. I know your time is very important, so thank you so much for joining me today. For ongoing insights surrounding these important topics, you can join the conversation on my social media channels, including Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Marc Beckman. And to sign up for my newsletter on Substack, you can find me at marcbeckman.substack.com. To make sure you don't miss a show, be sure to subscribe to Some Future Day across all major platforms worldwide, including YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Special thanks to New York University for producing Some Future Day, and a big shout out to my producer extraordinaire, John Boomhofer, for being patient and always encouraging me to push through. Thanks a lot, John. Have a great day.